Thank you very much. So myself and Sarah Scott from the Environment Agency are going to do a joint presentation to outline the combined process that's been developed by the Environment Agency and the Coal Authority to guide operators through the steps involved in obtaining relevant licences and permissions for open loop standalone schemes. There's been a wide range of individuals who've contributed to developing the process, but we'd particularly like to mention Sally Gallagher and Diane Steele at the North East Office of the Environment Agency and Lee White at the Coal Authority for their contributions to understanding the hydrogeology requirements. The process is designed as a guide to operators to set out the different steps involved in securing appropriate approvals from the two organisations during both the development and operation of the scheme. It's been developed within the existing legislative framework and currently remains a live document. As we pull together lessons learned from previous, ongoing and emerging schemes, it will continue to develop. An example of this is the complexity around understanding the hydrogeology, and Sarah's going to provide more detail around that at the second half of our talk. The process covers both Environment Agency and Coal Authority approvals for schemes in England. However, other permissions and notifications may be required, for example, from local planning authorities where planning permission may be required, or notifications to the Health and Safety Executive. So what approvals are needed and why? So we need different approvals at different stages of the process. Whilst an operator is completing their investigative or exploratory works, they will require a groundwater investigation consent, or a GIC, from the Environment Agency to allow for in giving permission to test pumping in advance of securing the relevant licences and permissions for a live scheme. At this stage, a mine water heat access agreement will also be required from the Coal Authority, which enables the operator to occupy Coal Authority interests during the testing phase, and permits to drill will be incorporated into this agreement. For a scheme to become operational, a water resource licence, which gives permission to abstract mine water, and an EPR permit, which gives permission to discharge or re-inject that water, is required from the Environment Agency. Before going operational, the deed of variation to the Coal Authority access agreement will be required. So this is the access agreement that's obtained for an exploratory phase, is then varied following appropriate assurance to enable the Coal Authority to grant longer term access for an operational scheme. And this will only be done once the assurance process is completed and also the Environment Agency have issued their licence and permit. So in terms of our emerging process, on the next slide, you'll see the current version of the timeline that we're developing. It's quite a busy slide, and that will develop over time. The slide's separated into 5 stages to recognise where in the process it's appropriate to stop and review the risks of a project. Whilst the Coal Authority requires some additional information to the Environment Agency, such as an assessment of gas risk and a review of ground stability, there is considerable overlap in the information that both organisations require to review the hydrogeology. The process has been developed to enable the same information in relation to the hydrogeology to be submitted to both organisations. So here is the emerging process. The slides that you can see, and I appreciate there's a lot of detail and it'll be difficult to read at this point in time. This sets out the steps and timeline in moving from an initial pre-application discussion with the Environment Agency and the Coal Authority, and from a Coal Authority perspective, that's in terms of talking to the licensing team about the process that you might need to follow and the information that we would be required to receive in order to complete the technical assurance process, right through to the decommissioning of a scheme. Whilst we can share this today, it needs to remember it is a live document and it's still being edited. It's not prescriptive in setting out exactly what has to be done by an operator and at what stage, but it does demonstrate what permissions will be required at each stage of the process. And as an indicative timeline at this point in time, as these schemes are developing, we consider that the fastest timeline to move through each stage from the start of a pre-application discussion to going live would be around 26 months. On the chart that you can see, The start of each of the 5 stages is identified by the rows that are currently pink in the Gantt chart. So we're looking at the pre-construction of boreholes. So this is where you would have your pre-application discussions, your need to apply for a groundwater investigation consent and a mine water heat access agreement. That moves on to when we construct the boreholes, testing the boreholes in the system, the pre-operational phase where we would continue with the technical assurance processes at both organisations, and then go in operational. Within the Gantt chart, the yellow rows are the tasks that we consider that the operator will be going away and doing work on their own, which doesn't necessarily involve submissions and an ongoing dialogue. Where that's relevant or where there's challenges, we would actively encourage that. And that's, for example, the point of which you'd be undertaking a water feature survey, drilling the boreholes, or undertaking your pumping tests. The blue and the green tasks are those that an operator would complete on behalf for each of the different organisations. So those in blue are those that would be working towards the coal authority processes, and those in green are the Environment Agency processes. And from the colour scheme, you can see how the process interweaves quite sort of intricately between the 2 organisations. And some of those tasks may be separated out as individual lines, but we would recommend that they're run in parallel, such as the submission of the hydrogeology assessments. I will now hand over to Sarah.
So, yeah, massive thanks to my colleagues in the North East Area Office, Sally Gallagher and Diane Steele, for the tremendous amount of work and time that they've put into pulling this together with the Coal Authority. So what I wanted to just emphasise, I suppose, from this is that the need for a hydrogeological conceptual model can't be underplayed, really. The applicant needs to produce it and agree it with the EA and the Coal Authority. And it needs to be done so that you can identify the target seams, and this all sounds a little bit obvious, and you might be thinking, well, you are going to say that because you're a hydrogeologist, but it's really important that the hydrogeologist is involved and that their advice is always sought when looking at projects. It needs to be the best understanding possible of the underground interconnections and what the movement of water is, because that's really what's going to drive the success or not of the project, and it'll help work out where the best places are to put the boreholes for abstractions and reinjections, and also to give the information that's required for the pumping tests and environmental risk impacts and things to allow us to make decisions about the permitting. It needs to be done at the outset of the project, and then it needs to be reviewed at every stage of the operation. It needs to be considered to be a living document. It isn't to be job done, tick on the shelf. It needs to be revised and revised and revised again every time you get more information. So where do you get the base information from? Obviously, we're looking at situations that have been modified, heavily modified by man below ground, so you can't necessarily see them. Some of those were done a long time ago, and some of the plans are limited in terms of information, and some of them are vague, and that for many reasons. Some may be because people have mined more than they wanted to let on. The plans might not work very well in terms of what you think is on the surface and what you find underneath. So in the northeast and the Durham coalfield, there's been quite a lot of work done producing 23 peer-reviewed hydrogeological conceptual reports for the different mine blocks. And this information is freely available to anybody in this area. I mean, I think that it's hoped we can provide these for different parts of the country as more and more people start looking at different coalfield areas, that these can form a basis for looking at how to provide those sort of reports to get that information out there. We've got active water levels that have been artificially lowered through extensive pumping. I mean, in 1976 in Durham and 2009 in Northumberland, when the mining activity ceased, the water levels have been rebounding. In some areas, these water levels are fully recovered, and in others, they're still rising. And in some areas, they're artificially controlled. So all of these things need to be taken into account when you're designing a scheme, and in order to prevent mine breakouts and groundwater flooding and things like that. The mine waters in some of these areas have risen over 100 metres. So these reports are available from the Environment Agency, and I can, if you contact myself or my colleagues in North East, we can provide those for you. And I think one of the salient points that we've really learned through the last year or so, or several years really for Diane and Sally, is just how complicated some of these situations can be, and particularly if you've got interactions. So the next slide is to do with working out hydrogeological conceptual models. So you can start with yours, and you can work out where you want your boreholes and what needs to be monitored and what might be around you in the vicinity very close. And then you need to set that into the wider context. So what else is going on? What other shafts might there be? What other interconnections might there be? And then somebody else can come along and want another scheme, and then they're going to have to tie that in to what you've got and how that affects the wider location, and they need to set that into a context. And then maybe somebody will come along and want another scheme, and then you can see from this diagram, this is just a cross section from a conceptual model, you can see just how complicated some of these interactions might end up being. And I think it's been borne out quite well in some of the talks, particularly from yesterday, and things that David Burks was saying earlier about unforeseen consequences when you start drilling and things like that. So it is hugely important that you get this bit right, and that you see it as something that's living and that it carries on moving as you go through your project. What I'd like to say at the end here is the takeout messages. Now, I spoke to you guys last year, and my takeout messages, the first two, haven't changed at all since last year. So early communication is key. Now, I think if you can arrange meetings where you can talk to both of us together, that's really useful, because that's the same information. You're not having to deliver things twice. You're not having to repeat things because you haven't got all the information one of us wants and the other one doesn't. So that's really a really key message. The process is time consuming. I don't think there's any way we're going to get around that. Because of the man-made feature of a mining water heat scheme, is just always going to take a long time to get all the information and to get all of the permits and get yourselves up and running properly into production. I think the hydrogeological conceptual model is the crucial part of the project, and it needs to be done up front and revised and revised and revised. So our timeline will help with all of this. It isn't an instruction. I make that clear. It's a process to help make it easier for everybody. So for us as regulators and for you guys as operators, it is a live document. So as we go forward, suggestions that you have when you've been trying to use it will be very welcome. The current version in the slide is still a draft, but it will be available at some point, hopefully very soon, for anybody who wants to ask for a copy. We would like to put it on gov.uk, but that's probably not going to be possible just because of the format of the document and its and the complexity of trying to get things onto gov.uk. So we might be looking for somewhere else to host the document to make it easy for people to get to. But at the moment, I'm sure that if you contact either the Environment Agency or the Coal Authority, we'll be able to provide you with that timeline so you can work on it. And then obviously continued communication again is key. Keep people informed. Let us know what's going on when things change, as they inevitably do once you've drilled your wells. let everybody know what's going on, and then we know what it is that we're looking at to permit. We understand the impacts. Yeah, so keep us informed. I think that's probably all I wanted to say.